Thank you so much for joining us today. This is the Arizona Daily Star's opinion interview with proponents and opponents of Proposition 206, which is the Tucson Minimum Wage Act. I'm Sarah Garrett Gasson, the opinion editor. We're here with Sarah Brown, who's our opinion coordinator, and John DiOrlando, who is the Star's president and publisher and a member of the editorial board. So the way it's going to work is we have Amber Smith, president and CEO of the Tucson Metro Chamber, who will be speaking for the opponents of Prop 206, and Billy Peard, who is a co-author and co-organizer of Tucson Fight for 15, which is the name of the proposition. So what we're going to do is have a conversation, pretty much. Each of you will have an opportunity to give a brief opening statement and then a closing statement too at the end. And rather than doing it strict time, 15 seconds, 30 seconds, I'm going to rely on each of you to keep your responses to the point, short, and answering the questions asked. If you would like to submit a question for me to ask the candidates, please do that through the chat feature. I'm sorry, Amber is the most recent president and CEO of the Tucson Metro Chamber. I want to make sure that's clear. Please go to the chat function at the bottom of your screen and type your questions in there. And what I will do is read through those as they come in. I have some questions of our own, and we will try to get as much information and as many of your questions answered as possible. So if you see me go like this, sort of wave at you, that means wrap it up. And if you are reading something, I may verbally interrupt just in case you don't see me as well. So with that, Mr. Peard, would you like to start us off with your intro?
Sure, thank you, Sarah and Sarah. Again, my name is Billy Peard. I'm a local Tucsonan, grew up here, graduate of CDO High School, and one of the co-authors, one of the attorneys who wrote the legalese behind what is now Proposition 206. I'll just say a few brief words. We'll get into more details, I'm sure, about what the policy does and does not do. As I'm sure most in the audience are already aware, it does one obvious thing. It proposes to raise the minimum wage for those workers who work inside the city limits of Tucson on a gradual basis from the current $12.15, which is the statewide minimum wage under state law. And we propose to make Tucson the second municipality in the state of Arizona to diverge from that state minimum wage, gradually, incrementally increasing up to $15 per hour, where it will reach that point in 2025, something we believe to be very gradual and incremental, and something that we hope our local business community is able to adjust to if Proposition 206 becomes law after November. Just real briefly, who does this benefit? We estimate this will put, just in the first year alone, in the year 2022 after implementation, would put $400 million additional into the pockets of working families. And who are these working families? Predominantly, they are not teenagers, they are families. They are folks with children, many single parents, predominantly women. More women than men will benefit if this becomes law, and more people of color will benefit than other demographics if this becomes law. And it has a number of other worker protections, which I'm sure we'll get into more detail. I'll just highlight a couple brief examples. Some of you may have worked in service industries or restaurant jobs in the past where you show up, maybe you don't have a car and you've taken a bus across town to get to your job on time. And the employer says, well, I'm sorry, we overscheduled today. We don't have enough customers. We're going to have to send you home prematurely after you've already worked your schedule around your life around the work schedule. This provision, for example, in addition to raising to $15, would allow for $3 of compensation for a worker who shows up on time, willing, able to work their scheduled work shift and sent home without notice. There's a few other provisions that are designed, we think, reasonable provisions to keep working families where they need to be. Thank you.
Thank you. Amber Smith.
This initiative does not raise minimum wage any faster than what is already in place. Instead, it's an attack on small businesses, older people with fixed incomes, those that work at restaurants, especially if you start having to eliminate your employees and go completely using technology instead of those servers that are working on those hourly shifts. The ballot initiative is an absolute trap for the unwary, a trap for those who are running their small business and they can't afford to hire an attorney to explain all of the different nuances in the law. And aside from the legality that we already question with aspects as well. Of these 6 pages, only a half page actually deals with raising the wage to $15 an hour. 5.5 pages relate to the punitive measures against employers. Ultimately, the cost of goods and services will increase. Employees making a higher wage ultimately are going to be paying higher costs outside of that, higher costs for childcare, rent, goods, services, and ultimately the only people who are going to win and benefit from Prop 206 are the attorneys.
Thank you for your opening statements. I want to reiterate that you can please put some questions into the chat feature. Those will go to me. I will keep track of them as we go along. With the Proposition 206, this is something that is a national issue. It's something that is not isolated to Tucson, but one of the questions after reading the proposition is, and other initiatives over the years have run into this too, why only focus on Tucson rather than all of Pima County? Because the natural thought is, well, people in Pima County are either going to, the city businesses might go to Pima County in case, in seeking to get around the minimum wage. Why only focus on Tucson? Mr. Peard?
Thank you, Sarah. Our committee came together, a group of predominantly nonprofit leaders and other community advocates, and we decided we had to start somewhere. That's not to say that we do not support. We absolutely do support a county-wide approach, and in fact, if the politics were to permit it, we would support a statewide approach. We fully anticipate and we hope that the County Board of Supervisors after this November, after voters have made their voice heard and have approved 15 in the city limits, we hope that we can come together with the business community and hash out a reasonable countywide ordinance that the County Board of Supervisors would support by a majority vote. And again, let me reiterate that our group is more than willing to work together with the business community and with Ms. Smith to make that happen. I understand they may disagree with some of the details in the city initiative. Well, here's the opportunity to collaborate and work together and negotiate on some of those details with which they may disagree. I will just real briefly.
If I could ask a quick question about that. So you're saying if the city have to start somewhere, start with Tucson, and then the hopes that the Board of Supervisors will then meet with you and business leaders to pass something countywide. So Mike, is that accurate?
Yes, and this is not something conjectural. I mean, this is something that's already in the public domain that at least 2 of the 5 supervisors have publicly come out in support of a countywide. 3 of the 5 have actually endorsed our city initiative. And as you know, anything to happen in the Board of Supervisors requires counting to 3. We think we can count to 3 without a question.
And then my other follow-up question to that was, what conversation with the business community did you or others have before writing the proposition and starting this effort?
We were in conversation with some small business owners prior to the drafting. The majority of our steering committee, we have what's called what we refer to as a steering committee that was involved in the drafting. It was a collaborative effort. Despite Ms. Smith's opening comments, it was not the product of lawyers. It was the product of local community members, nonprofit leaders, labor activists, and a small number of local business owners. Today, since drafting it, we have now, I think we now count approximately 80 local business owners, Tucson-based business owners, who have publicly endorsed the initiative because they see that even if they have not yet reached 15 for their own employees yet, they see that there are great economic benefits for them as a business owner to do so.
Thank you. Ms. Smith, would you like to respond?
Absolutely. So to start off the bat, the chamber, we represent 1,500 businesses. So I wouldn't say talking to a couple of small businesses really should justify saying that you met with the business community. And to clarify, I said that the only people that would benefit from this would be attorneys. I didn't say it was crafted by attorneys. And secondarily, from the dais, Supervisor Rex said that he absolutely would not support the minimum wage. He said that very publicly. We disagree about counting to 3, but more importantly, for us, this isn't about the wage. In fact, most of the business owners we know are paying $15 and well above that. And it is all of the things below the line that are most problemsome. I mean, they are incredibly difficult for businesses to absorb. And should the county even pass the $15 minimum wage, there will be mass confusion and chaos by businesses, because should this proposition pass within the city limits, the rules and regulations are still extremely cumbersome, difficult. In some cases, we think that the legality is incorrect. They go against federal law. So you would still have 2 different pieces of legislation, some of which is in conflict with existing legislation, to where not only would customers be confused, employees confused, and absolutely those small business owners as well. And I agree, there should have been a community-wide conversation that brought in the business community from the very beginning of crafting the proposition. And quite frankly, Mr. Peard would probably be pretty surprised that there would have been support for a $15 wage. There is absolutely no support for all of the minutia and other things that are incredibly punitive to employers. And quite frankly, this is just going to crush those employers and not even help those that are alleged for it to help. And I do question the $400 million that would benefit. That number came $400 million because we pulled census data and it showed that a majority of minimum wage owners were under the age of 23. I certainly know that there are young families, but we think that there should be something that benefits a whole lot more than those entry-level job owners such are in high school getting their first critical experience, because we agree that there should be a livable wage.
So for those of you who haven't read the initiative, it would amend the city code to incrementally increase the minimum wage from $12.15 to $15 by January 2025, and then it would be attached to the rate of inflation rounded to the nearest multiple of 5 cents. So it would also, and I think this is what Ms. Smith is referring to, the initiative would also establish a Department of Labor standards within the city. By April 1st, 2022, the department would be authorized to receive complaints from employees, to investigate employers and educate workers about their rights under the initiative. A violation of the initiative would be a civil infraction with a civil penalty of up to $100 per employee affected by the violation paid to the city. if multiple violations occur, the city may revoke, suspend, or decline to renew any license of the employer. So a question I have is, who pays for this Department of Labor within the city? Is that a cost that the city government bears?
Yes, Sarah. So when we drafted it, our intent was to give enough flexibility to the council and mayor to make that determination of where they were going to fund this. Let me clarify two things. Number one, it's a small amount in the grand scheme of things. The current city budget is 1.9 billion with a B dollars. What we're looking at is, again, this is up to the discretion of the city council once the voters approve it. But we anticipate that the cost of this office would be somewhere in the range of $300,000 to $500,000. We're talking about 3 or 4 additional employees, city employees, tasked with enforcement, but also, by the way, tasked with addressing some of Ms. Smith's concerns, which is education of the business community, so that they're not caught off guard. They're not required to hire their own lawyers to understand what their requirements are. So 3 or 4 employees we believe will accomplish all those things at a minimal cost to the city. The city council and mayor will have the discretion on where that money comes from. But at the end of the day, it's a rounding error in the grand scheme of the size of the city budget. And by the way, there are federal grants available and private foundation grants available to local governments for this purpose. So even if it were hypothetically $400,000, that may not be actually $400,000 of taxpayer dollars to local taxpayers.
A follow-up question then I have is, with the business community, Ms. Smith saying, many employers are on board with the minimum wage, it does make one wonder why the enforcement is so detailed, why the Department of Labor standards was this crafted in a response to an existing situation to keep employers from not following the law? Is there a precedent for that, or is this more of a prophylactic, preventative approach?
It's a combination of both, Sarah. I'm a firm believer that any regulatory law, there has to be enforcement. And by the way, the enforcement does not only accrue benefit to the workers, it also accrues benefit to the business community. We believe that the vast majority of business owners are doing the right thing, are striving to do the right thing, and are making ends meet while also complying with every legal requirement. But there are always, as in any walk of life, in any industry, in any topic, any policy topic we discuss, there's always a small percentage of the community of business owners, in this case, that will shirk their responsibilities. We believe that having an office of enforcement is not only the right thing for workers, it's also the right thing for small business owners who are playing by the rules, so that when they compete in the free marketplace, they're competing against other competitors who are playing by the same rules that they're playing by.
Ms. Smith, your thoughts?
Well, first off, with the cost of the department, I appreciate the transparency that it will be between $300,000 and $500,000. Sure, there may be grants, but that's a wish and a prayer. What we know is that cost is going to come from the budget, from a city that has consistently admitted to struggling with the cost of being able to cover things such as road repairs, public safety. So that cost in itself is questionable. And on that education aspect, what we're concerned about are those employers that unknowingly go against the proposition. By that point, they're already having to pay for those legal fees. And with the number of businesses in the community, the thousands of small businesses in the community, of which you say it's only a very small percentage are shirking their responsibility. I mean, I think that's fair. Absolutely. Not every single person does the right thing every single time. I think that's absolutely fair, and it's unfortunate. But when out of thousands of businesses, only a small percentage are the ones not following the rules, now you're going to burden all of them. And there's no way to be able to educate enough of them fast enough with just a few staff people. So immediately on those where there are complaints, and by the way, third-party people, so it can be even a customer or vendor that is upset with the business, and file that complaint as well. And a third of the fee that is assessed in the fines goes back to the complainant and the employee. So it completely incentivizes complaints. So I have a hard time believing that 3 or 4 city employees are going to be able to educate the thousands of small businesses in the community while responding to all of these complaints. Again, none of that is even happening as benefiting those employees that this is said to try to help. And it's just unfortunate that there wasn't a conversation to really talk about the issue of livability and affordability for those minimum wage earners. And instead, it's taken the approach to be punitive to those employers, where ultimately it's going to drive up the cost of important services that minimum wage workers and more need, such as childcare, groceries, goods, and services.
So a question we have from the audience for Ms. Smith is, why should ethical business owners and the chamber be so fearful of an enforcement clause?
I don't think anyone's fearful of an enforcement clause. That has nothing to do with fear. It has to do with the language within this proposition. We've sent it to 3 different attorneys, and they are saying that there are very confusing aspects, some of which question legality of clauses. It goes against federal regulation. There's the question of which is going to supersede state law, county, or federal. So it's not about that. I don't think anyone's afraid of that. Absolutely. And then employers' hours are going to get cut. I mean, I think that that is a reality to where the employees are going to end up getting hurt. There's no fear that they're doing anything wrong. And you know what? Bad operators, absolutely. They absolutely, whatever provisions are in place, whether it is a decline in receiving business, placing Google negative reviews, etc. You know what? They should be held accountable. Absolutely. But even Billy said that it's a small percentage of those that are the poor performing employers. And yet a majority, every single one of them within the city limits, or those that do business in the city limits, even though your operations are in the county, are all going to be held to these same exact rules and that possibility of complaints.
So we
Only
have
if I could ask.
we have a question from John D'Orlando, our president and publisher.
What recourse do employees have right now? If those issues arise right now, do they not have recourse through the state?
It's a good question. And that's one of the key reasons why we included this provision here, going back to answering your question, and also answering one of Sarah's previous questions, whether this is prophylactic or proactive or reactive. And the short answer is there's virtually no enforcement under current federal or state apparatus. I'll give you a couple examples. If you're a low-wage worker who claims that you were paid $11 an hour and you were supposed to be paid $12.15, you can make a complaint through what's called the Arizona Industrial Commission, which is the state agency tasked with enforcement. According to the only study I'm aware of that has done a 50-state survey, the Arizona Industrial Commission employs 3 full-time state employees for the purpose of enforcing the minimum wage law statewide. There are 7.5 million Arizonans, about 60% of those are in the workforce. So imagine having Tucson, the size of 550,000 population. Imagine having maybe 2 police officers employed to enforce the laws locally. At the federal level, the same story is true. Keep in mind that the federal minimum wage remains at what it's been since 2009, which is $7.25. So in order for the federal Department of Labor to even have jurisdiction over enforcement of a wage violation, the worker has to allege to the Department of Labor at the federal level that their wages have fallen below $7.25. As the years go on and inflation eats away, it's even the worst of the worst employers are not paying less than $7.25 anymore.
Thank you. Ms. Smith, do you have anything you'd like to add to that?
I'm sorry, if I could just
Go
add
ahead.
on to that. Do we think that that's an issue right now? Do we think that there are a substantial number of small businesses that are not paying minimum wage right now? Do we think that that's an issue?
The reality is we don't have for the same reason I just explained, we don't have good statistics because there are no real state or federal agencies that have a good finger on the pulse of this problem. I will say, to answer your question, no, I don't believe there's a large number of businesses violating. I do believe that there are a large number of workers employed by a small number of employers who are receiving less than the legal minimum wage currently.
And is that, anecdotally, how do you come to that conclusion?
There are a number of studies. I'll give you a couple think tanks that have done research on this in recent years. One of them is called the National Employment Law Project, also known as NELP. The other is an organization called the Economic Policy Institute, EPI, out of Washington, D.C. Both them and many others have come to the same conclusion that what we lawyers refer to as wage theft, the phenomenon that the publisher is referring to, is a common common problem. And by some measurements, it actually results in a larger dollar amount loss to the average American than home invasions, car thefts, electronic financial fraud, computer fraud combined. Right? Basically every other form of money theft you can imagine. Theft from wages amounts to a larger proportion.
Ms. Smith?
Well, the EEOC at the federal level is incredibly engaged on employee protections. And it's very difficult to try to avoid them. And they, like I said, are very engaged. And it's an extremely well-funded department to be able to stay on top of them. And regarding 725, one, it's not an issue in Tucson, but I agree that's just disgusting. That there is no part of that makes that a livable wage. So it shouldn't even be part of this conversation, because thank goodness our community is not at that level. And quite frankly, those bad employers that are not paying minimum wage and are avoiding these different things, this isn't going to change them. Those bad actors will still exist. And I don't agree with it. I'm grateful that it's a small minority of them. I don't know any of them because, again, I actively was trying to go out and talk to employers and find out what are your wages? What is your lowest rate? And conclusively, every single one, there was an exception, which was a landscape company pays his day laborers minimum wage. So absolutely, we did come across one. That is the only case where we saw that. Even our fast food restaurants were paying above minimum wage because it's a really tight labor market. And just to be able to find talent is challenging. So employers are doing sign-on bonuses, paying well above $15 an hour. And again, I wish there had been a community conversation so we can really talk about lifting people up, all people, through more than just employers getting trampled on with this. And talk about wages, talk about skilling up employees, like funding that type of a program, $500,000 to fund this local labor department. Much better idea, I think, would be to be able to fund workforce development efforts by the city so that you can impact and really grow the talent of our community that then earn a higher wage for their family, well over and beyond that $15 an hour.
Thank you. A question I have from the text of the proposition is, it makes it clear that you don't have to have a social security number to be protected by this within the city of Tucson. Other than people who are working without immigration documentation, who is that targeted at? And why did you feel the need to include that? What issue is that addressing?
Thank you, Sarah. That's a really good question. I think what you're referring to is a provision that spells out the method of payment. So once we agree that a worker has to be paid a certain amount per hour per week, the question then becomes, in what method does that worker receive the pay? Now, most of us are used to direct deposit, or we're used to a paper check being issued to us, increasingly direct deposit. But in many low-wage industries, the janitorial industry, I can name a number of others, employers are opting for what's called a pay card. It's like this debit card that is completely detached from a bank account. It's just a kind of a free-floating debit card called a pay card, oftentimes issued by companies like ADP, payroll processing company. and they market their services to low-wage employers. And the employers oftentimes market this as a benefit to the worker. And in many ways, it is a benefit because it's easier to access your cash. You can go to any ATM to withdraw the money that's been deposited every week on your card. But as we also know, for those of you who may have bank accounts with banks that don't have physical branches here in Tucson, you have to pay a premium at the ATM to access a different bank's ATM. If you're making minimum wage, a $4 or $5 access fee is no small matter. And so that's what that provision is dealing with. It's not only undocumented workers who may lack Social Security numbers. It's also unbanked. There are a number of US citizens, houseless individuals, elderly folks who increasingly lack photo IDs, and therefore they lack banks because banks require photo IDs. And so this provision says an employer still has the flexibility to choose how they can pay their employee in what method. But if they cannot make a pay card or a similar type of method the only option. So if you are an employer who uses a pay card, you have to offer to the employee at least a secondary option. That could be paying cash. It could be paying check, for example.
Ms. Smith?
The Social Security number piece has been very confusing for us and the 3 attorneys we had to review this, because it is specifically how it is written goes against the federal standards and requirements for employers in the use of Social Security numbers. Again, I wish there had been a conversation in advance, because I appreciate the concern of that fee and the impact it does have for those that have unconventional banking practices, because it would seem there would be a more reasonable way to perhaps just the employer absorb that additional fee rather than the employee with these different payment methods. But to have that employer have to choose to follow the local statute on the Social Security issue and go against federal, again, creates that issue where they're going to have to hire accountants and attorneys to work with them directly to see how they can not go against federal laws.
May I respond just briefly to that one minor point about the legality?
Yes.
And I don't want to belabor the point, but just to note that it is absolutely true, as Ms. Smith points out, that under federal law, an employer is not to hire someone who lacks federal immigration papers. We can all agree that that's what the law is. That is a federal law. However, our city ordinance is going to do nothing to increase or decrease the rate at which employers choose to hire who they wish to hire. Having hired someone, federal law also says you have to pay them. The Federal Labor Standards Act at the federal level also says, regardless of who you hire, even if you hire someone who lacks a Social Security number, you still got to pay them. Not paying them is a violation of federal law too. So we're not wading into that debate with this ordinance. All we're saying is we're making life a little bit easier for those who are employed, regardless of your situation, regardless of whether you lack a bank account for lack of a Social Security number or whether you lack a bank account for some other reason.
And Billy, we want to make sure that you're not encouraging employers to pay in cash, because if there is an employer paying in cash, that it is illegal. So we certainly wouldn't be supporting that. I know you didn't mean that when you said that too, because you have to be able to pull out payroll taxes and all of these things, and it's just not allowed.
So a question, Ms. Smith, you've mentioned several times that it would have been great to have had a larger conversation before this initiative went forward. It was filed in February, which is, and many months working on it, gathering signatures, things like that. Did you or the chamber or anyone that in the business community that you know of make those overtures trying to get involved?
There were some conversations, not directly from the chamber, but there was some reach out to Billy at that time. We honestly, due to some of the clauses in there, such as that Social Security number and how confusing it was, we're pretty surprised that the number of signatures were collected. I think that a lot of people didn't understand some of these clauses and just saw the $15 minimum wage and so put it on the ballot. And unfortunately, we were a little too sophisticated in what we saw on that. So no, there was not a community conversation at all. It was pretty insulated to just the group that put it together, which was a lot of people, absolutely. But as far as my colleagues, none of us were invited to participate.
Did you ask to participate?
We didn't know the conversations were going. By that point, they were collecting signatures.
Mr. Peard, what do you have to say about that? Why not incorporate or go to business communities and say, this is an issue, this is what we want to do, let's work together?
Well, I acknowledge we did not go through the formal Tucson Metro Chamber of Commerce, which Ms. Smith represents, but we did, as I mentioned earlier, talk with individual business owners as part of the drafting process. And as I mentioned earlier, it was a collaborative drafting experience. I was at the table for multiple meetings where we were drafting it, we were getting input. And I will say that a lot of the final provisions reflected some of the pushback we received internally from some of the voices, the business voices at the table, who were saying, we had some people at our table in the drafting phase who were saying, let's go up to $15 more quickly. 2025 is not fast enough. There were others who said it's too, we should push it out to 2026. So that was a collaboration, that was a conversation. I think we ended up with a fairly reasonable time frame at which it reaches the $15. I believe the inflation provision that you mentioned, Sarah, that we incorporated, where it goes up at very small amounts after 2025, that was the product of a lot of discussion with community partners at the table, business partners at the table.
Well, on that, with the $15 an hour, again, you've heard me say very little about that, because this proposition brings it to $15 an hour at the same speed that we already are statewide due to the inflation that's built into what exists. So those conversations at the speed of when you bring it in a collaborative conversation based on that isn't even part of our concerns, because we're already going to be there. It's everything else that is extremely concerning.
A question that's come in is, how many minimum wage workers are we talking about within the city limits? And is it workers that do their work in a company located within the city, even if they're going into the county to do, like, deliver a pizza or something like that?
That's a very good question. So let me address the last question first, actually. Again, I'll reiterate that we are fully supportive of a countywide solution after this passes at the city level. Again, we consider us partners to try to implement this at a countywide level where that becomes less of a question. But let's take the initiative that's before us at the moment. In the case of workers who work portion of their week inside the city limits or portion of their week outside the city limits, let's take, for example, a plumber. I realize most plumbers are probably already making above minimum wage, but that's a simple conceptualization because they work all around the region. The ordinance says if a worker works, I believe it's 3 hours or less than 3 hours inside the city limits, the employer, for simplicity to the employer, we say, don't worry about it. Don't worry about complying with the city ordinance. But once your employee works above that number of hours in a given week, in a given 7-day period of time, then it triggers. Again, it's only those hours performed inside the city limits. We recognize that for employers like a plumbing business, just a lack of a better example, that might come with some administrative burden. But again, that's why we carve out those first few hours to say, if there's a business that operates 90% in Marana and Oro Valley and only a small amount incidentally, serving clients inside the city limits, don't worry about it. We're not going to put you on the hook under this ordinance. And I'm sorry, Sarah, you asked a question before that.
About what you just said raised another question. But the question was, how many minimum wage workers are we talking about within the city limits?
Thank you. And that number is not an easy one to ascertain with any degree of certainty. Our campaign had originally predicted it was in the neighborhood of 80,000. That was back in the wintertime when we were starting this campaign. And as all of you know, and as Ms. Smith has pointed out, the labor market has tightened a lot and wages have increased through the natural market. in the past 8 months. For that reason, we believe the number of workers who would receive a direct pay raise is probably less than 85,000 inside the city limits at this point, probably closer to 50,000.
If you don't know how many workers would be covered, where does that 400,000 or whatever the
400 million?
400 million, where does that come from then?
That comes from the more conservative number. So when I do math, I try to always go with the more conservative. That is the 50,000 workers, which I think is a more realistic figure now that, as Ms. Smith pointed out, the labor market is tightening. And that's taking into account, by the way, again, more conservatively, that the average worker is not necessarily working a full 40 hours a week, that the average worker below 15 is not working a full 40 hours a week. And so that uses a 30-hour-a-week number, gives them a 2-week-a-year vacation, so 50 weeks a year. And that's where we get that number.
Thank you. John D. Orlando.
So Billy, the part 2 of that question, which you answered first, are you implying that a worker 1 week can make $15 an hour and the next week be back down to $13 an hour because of where he was sent to work?
In sort of the, for lack of a better example, yeah, in the plumber example, that could be a scenario. Let's say you have a plumber who's working a really large job that takes them all 5 days of the work week inside the city limits of Tucson. So the law would require that employer to pay the 15 minimum. And let's say the following week, they receive a series of clients that are exclusively in Sahuarita, Morena, and Oro Valley, where the law does not apply. So that in that example, yes, you're correct.
That seems like an administrative nightmare. How do you keep track of that?
And again, we tried to reduce that administrative nightmare by sort of creating a buffer of how many hours.
What was the figure on the hours?
I believe it was 3. You actually, you're forcing me to pull up memory from several months ago. Let me pull it up real quick to get it.
I think it's 5, but I agree when we've talked to really those in the construction industries are big and those service providers from day to day. It's also not just the city limits, it's unincorporated as well. And so many businesses don't even know, okay, are we in the city limits? Are we not? Is our client, our customer in the city limits? So absolutely, just the HR part of it, and then the administrating of trying to determine what that is. Again, I mean, Billy was right. This should be something statewide or even national, because this inconsistency between when you're on one street, what's being paid on the left side of the street versus the right is incredibly confusing.
Thank you for those thoughts. We have a question from our participants. Ms. Smith, you've said that the state wage will be at $15 by then, 2025 anyway. According to the Grand Canyon Institute, that's not accurate. That it would be at about $13.50 by 2025, based on the inflation measures in current state law. So where do you get the information that it'll reach $15 by 2025 anyway?
We got that from the state that because inflation, especially right now, I mean, we saw it in the cost of construction goods, that it is the highest and fastest that they have really seen it. And so that was a prediction from the state on that.
Okay, thank you.
And if I might just add to that, I don't disagree with Ms. Smith that if the inflation rates that we've been seeing the last 4 months, what most economists agree is kind of a COVID special inflation phenomenon. If those inflation rates were to persist for the next 5-6 years, I don't disagree that we would probably be close to 15 by 2026 anyway. But based on, I agree with Sarah that most likely the inflation rate is going to not persist at the 5% rate. The historical inflation rate is 1.7%. The historical inflation rate since the Great Recession of 2009 up until COVID was about 1.7% per year. And based on those numbers, we would reach $15 under the current state law in the year 3034.
So another comment from the gallery saying if people are paying minimum wage already at $15 is sort of a de facto minimum wage already, is there, what kind of problem would it be then going between jurisdictions? Would that mitigate that administrative task somewhat?
Sorry, could you repeat or rephrase the question?
Yeah, the question is, if employers are already paying are paying $15 an hour as sort of a de facto minimum wage, does that reduce the administrative tracking business would have to do between business done within the city limits and outside the city limits? I mean, does that sort of render that
Certainly.
complaint about it moot?
Certainly, yeah, and I should also say $15 by 2025. If an employer is paying $13 next year, region wide, if they have employees working in Marana and Tucson and Oro Valley, and they're paying at least 13, that would essentially render the administrative burdens moot. And then I'll also add that a lot of these city wage ordinances, and there's now about 50 of them nationwide. 80–90% of them include an express record keeping provision. Ours does not, precisely for that reason. We did not want to add that additional burden on small business owners. So we actually deviate from the norm in terms of the other major cities in the country that already have minimum wages and expressly require and penalize employers for not maintaining records. The record keeping is up to the business. It's not something that the city government agency is going to meddle in.
Yeah, Ms. Smith.
So what I want to add to is that employer that right now is paying $15 an hour above minimum wage, what they are going to have to deal with is compression, because the reason they're paying $15 an hour is to be competitive and to be able to bring in the talent that they want. Once you raise the minimum wage to that point, they have to raise the wages of all of their employees so that they maintain the morale of those employees. Hey, I earned above minimum wage because I do such an awesome job. Well, wait a second. Now you're saying that minimum wage is what I make. You only think that I am a minimum employee. So that $13 minimum wage, which now they're paying $15 because they want to compensate that employee, is now going to be $17 an hour. And then that person that was making 17 has to absorb the compression and say, hey, I need to make more than the person that I'm managing, and they're going to need 19, and so forth, so on. So even though those employers today are doing the right thing to compensate their employees at that level and above minimum wage, they're going to get hit just as hard.
Mr. Peard?
Our group, our team acknowledges that compression is a thing, and I think Ms. Smith described it quite well, the phenomenon of compression. We argue that that's a net benefit to local business owners overall. Yes, we acknowledge that somebody who, let's say today, is earning 17, in a couple of years from now, when the city minimum increases, well, is that employer going to feel morally and practically compelled to increase that $17 worker to 19? Yes, that is absolutely true. Also, workers are consumers, and the studies are very clear that when folks at the lower end of the socioeconomic spectrum get a pay bump, both minimum wage workers and those just a bit above minimum wage, when they get pay bumps, where do they spend that additional income? They spend it by and large locally. Unlike when folks on the upper end of the socioeconomic spectrum get pay raises, they tend to spend it in stock investments, real estate investments, vacations to Europe. So we believe that what's good for the worker is also good for the business owner, because yes, they might have to pay a $17 an hour worker 19. Well, those extra $2 are going to go into the local economy to buy more oil changes, more dental cleanings, more local products.
Ms. Smith?
I appreciate that stat. I didn't know that about low income workers and being able to do that versus high income. I don't know how those high income wagers speak, and I'm looking forward to one day doing that European adventure. But the problem is these employers can't just absorb the higher labor costs. I mean, I'm an employer and I recognize there's only so much money to be able to compensate. And as a small business, they already have such minimum profit margins, if they are even profitable. And that is a big if, because so many of them run in the red until they, for several years until they can really get going. But because they can't absorb it, the consumer absorbs it. And we did talk to our colleagues in Flagstaff to find out what happened. I mean, because Billy said that we want to be the second community in Arizona to have that $15 minimum wage. And we want to do our due diligence and find out what are those issues that they experienced. And I was most surprised. I can absolutely see it in cost of retail, groceries, rent, all of that makes sense to me. I had naturally kind of thought of that. Childcare. I was really surprised to hear about that higher cost of childcare. So even though those low income earners are making more and have a tendency to shop local when they do, the problem is they're going to have to pay more for the goods and services that they are already using. Those single moms that have their child in childcare, well, that childcare center is going to have to increase their costs as well. And again, these are not businesses with large profit margins. They have to pass it through to the consumer. So ultimately, those that were saying that we want to help here, we're not helping. There is no net benefit to them. And again, that's why I wanted a community conversation on this, because there are so many other issues that we could be talking about that truly lift people up to make higher wages, to earn higher wages. But let's talk about ways to be able to reduce those costs, reduce childcare costs. I mean, it's exceptional that our community has rallied and now is offering childcare center or childcare supplements from the city and the county, and some efforts that we absolutely supported. Let's talk about housing affordability. Let's talk about how can we reduce transportation costs. Let's really talk about living affordability and livable living, not this notion of a livable wage.
So, Ms. Smith, you've said on several occasions that the $15 an hour minimum wage isn't an issue for the business community, that many employers are there now, that's not the issue, that it's the stuff below the enforcement and the rest. But from what you just said, it sounds like you're opposing any sort of minimum wage coming from an outside, rather than just the business doing it on their own. Or is it? So I guess my question is, are you opposing the minimum wage as the amount, the $15, which you had said wasn't the issue? Or is it the idea that there would be a required minimum wage?
What I'm opposing is the notion that this is helping employees. And ultimately, this is not helping the employees. So having this falsified notion that if we raise wages, it's going to help the employees, we're just saying that it's not. Our employees are paying the wage. I mean, that's already happening. But I absolutely do not think this is dedicated to helping those minimum wage earners, because ultimately it's not going to, because they're going to be paying for higher goods in the end, because there will be a pass through. That employer is passing through that cost. So for them, it's kind of a net too. You're going to charge me more, I'm going to charge you more. So all the minutia that is absolutely detrimental to those businesses and costs real money, thousands of dollars in legal fees, punitive against them, creates confusion for them, creates confusion for the consumer. Absolutely, all a reality. I actually want to help the employee. I want to do something meaningful that benefits the employees. And this notion that $15 an hour is the way to do that is just false.
Mr. Peard, your thoughts?
Well, I would just, in talking about whether it helps or hinders the very population we're trying to help, we intend to help here, the workers. I would point to housing, a topic that all of us have, has been forefront of mind for many of us, and Daily Star has written many stories in recent months about the rising cost of housing. By some studies, in the Tucson metro area, rental costs have increased 15% since the beginning of the pandemic. Wages, need to catch up. And when we talk about inflation as a result of wage increases, that is true for certain things. I think when you buy a gallon of milk at the convenience store, that price of milk is going to increase slightly because that store clerk is being paid $1 or $2 more an hour than they had been previously. But think about the largest single expenditure of the average family, and let's think about the single parent household. Their largest expenditure is by leaps and bounds rent or housing. And that cost of housing is going up with or without us. It's going up with or without $15 minimum wage. The $15 minimum wage, if it becomes implemented, is not going to contribute to further housing increases. It's going to help catch up to the single largest expenditure of the average family in this town. And I'll also point out that productivity, worker productivity, continues rising at a much faster pace than wages. Wages have grown a little less than 20% adjusted for inflation since 1979, but the GDP, the productivity has grown by 60%, meaning that employers and workers are both benefiting. I would suggest also that when workers are paid more, they're more efficient. They have lower worker turnover. Employers spend less time recruiting, hiring, and training their workers because their workers stay longer. And so these are all benefits, I think, to workers and employers.
Okay, I have a question for Ms. Smith, and then we'll get to our closing statements. I want to thank everyone for joining us today, and this will be available online at tucson.com. So Ms. Smith, are you in a position to say that the business community, the Metro Chamber is willing to come to the table if this passes and work on something countywide to have those conversations that you had said that you wished had happened before the city initiative came to be?
Of course. I mean, we're happy to engage in the conversation. We actually are also aware and engaged in a conversation about creating a statewide $15 an hour. Including the business community prevents the negative consequences and unintended consequences, such as everything below the line here. Again, wage is one thing, but all of these other issues that are built into this are the ones that are incredibly detrimental and will drive businesses out of the city limits. It's going to have companies not want to come into the city limits. We want to talk about lifting people up. One of our core focuses at the chamber is workforce development, which is having people grow their skills and earn a higher wage. Billy's right. When you pay people more, they perform better. There is no argument about that. When people have higher skills, you pay them more as well. This isn't about the wage. Right now, as I already said, we have talked to one employer that is paying minimum wage, and that was for a day laborer. The free market is already addressing the wage issue, which is awesome. It is awesome that the employers are responding to these issues by paying more, by doing tuition reimbursement programs, on-the-job training. That is an awesome environment to be in. So why be so punitive to employers?
Thank you. Mr. Peard?
Thank you. Again, this, front and center of this initiative are working families who are trying to pay the rent in a market that is increasingly outpricing them. And we are also, by the way, helping business owners. We're not targeting business owners, and we are not trying to be punitive on business owners. And we've had many discussions in the drafting phase in terms of how we can limit and reduce the administrative burdens that Ms. Smith seems to be particularly concerned about. In terms of, I will just say, because I think this is a looming question that has come up in several questions today about the differential between the city and the county, should this pass just at the city level. And I will say, again, we are committed to doing it regionally, but even if for whatever circumstances it does not come to fruition in the near future at the county level, and it does at the city level, the studies in other parts of the country have universally shown that there's not a big sucking sound going out to the suburbs when the major cities pass a higher wage. We've seen it in studies conducted between New Jersey and New York about 8-9 years ago, when New York State was increasing their wage far ahead of New Jersey. And what we saw was in the hospitality and the restaurant industry, and pretty much every industry measured, the industries increased their business by 5%, and workers increased their wages on both sides of the state line by 5%. Same was true in Seattle. Same is true in Albuquerque and Bernalillo County, where they have for many years had a slightly higher minimum wage, which goes to show that this phenomenon is not just on the east, the East Coast and the West Coast major metropolitan areas. Also in the heart of the country, we see this phenomenon where the anecdotal stories, the fear mongering, if you will, simply does not play out when you look at the aggregate, when you look at the statistics. And fortunately, we're not legislating here on a tabula rasa. We're not on a blank canvas. We are, if Tucson passes this in November, it will become the 56th, I believe, municipality in the country to have a higher municipal wage than its surroundings. So we think this will help workers. We think it will help businesses. We don't think it will help hurt or affect employment or affect the Tucson economy.
Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you, Amber Smith from the Tucson Metro Chamber and Billy Peard from the Tucson Fight for 15. So we will see what the voters say. Thank you very much.
Thank you.